Hello, my name is Daniel Paye, and today I'll be just talking about threat modeling for ICS and the IoT, or also known as the IIoT. Today's agenda, I'm going to be speaking about what is ICS, or Industrial Control System, and the Industrial Internet of Things. Also, risk and threats. What is threat modeling? Why threat model? Stride and the cyber kill chain. How to perform a threat model. Assessing risks. And hopefully there'll be some questions and answers after this. So let's start with a definition. What is ICS, or Industrial Control Systems? ICS is also known as operational technology, and it refers to the networking of operational processes in ICS, including HMIs, or human machine interfaces, supervisory control and data acquisitions, also known as SCADA, and distributed control systems and PLCs, meters, and other things. Basically, what ICS is what brings us the conveniences and the technology that our society enjoys today: electrical, water, gas, heating, and so forth. The IIoT, also known as the Industrial Internet of Things, is used in the industrial sectors and applications. It's got a strong focus to machine-to-machine communications. IoT enables industries and enterprises to have better efficiency and reliability in their operations. Companies now that leverage this whole cloud IoT integration with the ICS world can make some quicker decisions and can just better monitor things in greater efficiency. It's also known as cyber physical, and it's also the beginning of what they call the Industry 4.0, or the next industrial revolution. That's kind of what my background and where I'm coming from. So what is the difference between ICS? Well, in information technology, we have confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Many say that operational technology is kind of the opposite: availability, integrity, and confidentiality. And I feel that's incorrect. I really think what cyber physical, or OT ICS is safety and reliability, then confidentiality, because we deal with safety. We deal with controls of chemical mixtures. We deal with circuit breakers. For example, the last thing you want is a hacker getting into a circuit breaker, throwing a switch. If electricity is lost in an operating room, some very bad things can happen. So those are the real critical differences, right? In IT, you have a window, you can reboot. I have an IT background, whereas in the OT world, rebooting, you can't reboot in a nuclear reactor turbine if you have to make changes to a PLC or other control systems from a reactor. So very, very different mentality. And that makes the big differences. And this is how I approach threat modeling when I do it. So let's look at risk management, right? Because when we threat model, it's all about risk. And the purpose is to reduce the risk and impact of a cyber attack. All right, so here's some cybersecurity risk definitions. And there is some controversy on risk, but this is what the textbooks say, and people disagree with this, but for the sake of the presentation, I'm going to go with this definition. Risk is an expectation of a loss expressed in the probability that a particular threat will exploit a particular vulnerability with a particular consequence. So here's a formula, right? It's threat times vulnerability times consequence, and then you have risk as the likelihood times the impact. So that's a formula on risk. Risk tolerance is what is an organization willing to accept. That's where upper management has to be involved. What is it they're willing to accept as a risk if there's an issue that's found? Because now you're looking at what is the cost, what is the time. It gets into a whole other level here of thinking. And then, like I said, the tolerance has to be addressed by upper management. And then the response to risk. There are several potential responses to risk. And one is you design the risk out, you reduce the risk, you accept the risk, or you transfer the risk. And then, of course, you want to eliminate ineffective controls. Why bother having them, right? So that's kind of the risk management idea that I've gone to work with in my career. And then you have threat, vulnerability, and consequence definitions. So what is the definition of a threat? Well, a threat is a potential for violation of security, which exists when there's a circumstance, capability, action, or event that could breach security and cause harm. So we have one example of a threat is passive, gathering information by observing, sniffing, or snooping, right? You could have a person rogue on your network, puts Wireshark, starts sniffing traffic, right? Kind of get an idea what's going on. And then the active hacker is one who can get in, search, and exploit vulnerabilities to a system or device. I mean, there have been cases where, ICS systems are found online, and some pretty bad things have happened. A vulnerability is a flaw or a weakness in a system or a device design, implementation or operation, and management that could be exploited to violate the system's device integrity. So some examples, buffer overflows, unsigned software or unsigned firmware in an embedded device, direct internet access, clear text passwords, and hard-coded secrets. All of these things you shouldn't have, right? We should not have these in our systems. And what's the consequence of this? Well, unauthorized access, theft, misuse of confidential information. This gets very critical now with data privacy laws such as the GDPR in Europe and other regions in the world. Loss of integrity or reliability of processed data. Very critical in ICS, right? We need that reliability. It's extremely important. Loss of resource availability, compromised process functionality, violation of legal, regulatory requirements, equipment damage, or personal injury and death. So as I mentioned, in the case of a circuit breaker getting hacked. So these are the definitions of a threat, a vulnerability, and a consequence. So what is threat modeling? Well, threat modeling should be part of the SDL, right? The security development lifecycle, something that everyone that develops products or software should be doing. It's something that was pioneered by Microsoft. We'll discuss a little bit more about that. But it's also a way to identify and prioritize potential threats and putting mitigations in place against identified threats. These mitigations are to protect the functionality of devices and systems, thereby improving the security posture to protect safety and confidentiality. All right, so that's kind of the idea behind threat modeling. But then the question is why? And when we do a threat model, you want to find a security flaw early in development, right? You don't want to lay down, your code and then you come back, right? You want to do a threat model before you lay down code. It saves time, revenue, and safeguards corporate reputation. You build a secure device, application, or cloud environment. It builds a bridge between developers and security. It is a great way to build a bridge and fill that gap between developers and security, because that's kind of building relationships. And it documents identified threats and ratings of those threats. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the relationship, it also trains, right? Because when we threat model, it's part of that whole, you want to get into the DNA of your development and your company that, security is from the get-go, right? It has to be part of your DNA if you want to make successful and secure products and software. So that's kind of a part of the whole reason of threat modeling. And as I said earlier, it is part of the SDL. And hopefully you all are following the SDL in your practices. All right, so let's look at some concepts of threat modeling. All right, so vision. All right, you start envisioning how is your application, device, or system is going to be used and potentially abused. And you're going to do use cases, right? So you can have multiple drawings with different use cases. For example, the model itself, you create a model that describes the application's functionality and architecture. Typically, you want to start simple and expand where necessary. And you want to create an overview model with the submodels that can simplify complex systems. I've done some very simple threat models. I've done threat models that have as many as 11 different drawings, depending on the size. And that was a huge, huge project. You identify the threats. Well, you analyze the model to identify potential threats to a system that constitutes elements. I use the STRIDE methodology, so we use STRIDE to threat identification methodology, which can aid in this exercise. And I'll talk more about STRIDE in a bit. And then the mitigations. For each threat, you document an existing mitigation and identify the gaps where the controls or mitigations are weak or non-existent. Where this occurs, document potential mitigations and the controls that you're putting into place. And then you want to validate the accuracy of the model. And typically, when you finish your drawing, you're with your entire group. I'll discuss later on who should be involved in a threat model. And you all agree that this model is complete. All right. Okay, we'll move on here. So let's look at some of the language of a threat model. All right. So these elements are, I think, pretty universal in different types of threat model tools I have used. So the first one is the external entity. Well, what does that mean? An external entity can be a human user, a device, a program outside of your control, even a cloud environment that's outside your control. So if you, like, for example, if you have an embedded device that's sending data up to the cloud. Some examples, an HMI can be outside your device, a human machine interface, a PC running a SCADA software, applications, or another embedded system like a PLC or circuit breaker. Next element is the data flow. Data flow is the communication between processes, data stores, and external entities. Some examples would be a network connection, an API, right? Typically, you want to define, you want to detail show what is the protocol being used. In ICS, we have different protocols, more than just TCP/IP. We have Modbus, we have BACnet, and several others. The next one, the circle, is a process. And what is that? That is any running code or software. And some examples would be C, C#, Python, or some other codes that you may be using. The next one is the data store. And basically, that's things that store data, which can be a file, can be databases, can be memory devices. All right, so data stores are very important, and the security of that data is important, which we'll look at a bit later. The trust boundary, which, as you see, it's a box, and basically what a trust boundary is an element within a boundary that trusts each other. So you can have different processes on an embedded device going to a data store, and those would be inside a trust boundary because they're on the same card, for example, or board, excuse me, right? So that's some examples of the language that we use when we draw a threat model. All right, some examples. There's more than this, but these are some tools that I have personally played with. The stride I've mentioned earlier, I really like the stride method because it is application-centric, right? It helps identify relevant mitigating techniques. It is the most mature methodology. It is easy to use. It also can take up a lot of time. So no tool is perfect, but I really like this one. But to be fair, I want to present other ones. There's what's called PASTA, Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. It's more of a risk-centric approach. As well, it does a lot of the things as the stride. It contains built-in prioritization and threat mitigations. Of course, encourages collaboration, but I think when you do a stride threat model, as I do, there's always collaboration. Octave is for focusing on assessing organizational risks that may result from breached information assets. A little bit on this too. One of the drawbacks of this one to me is it's time consuming and the documentation isn't that great. Again, this is my opinion on Octave, right? It does a lot of things, but it's a little hard to use in my opinion. Trike is a risk-based approach with risk modeling process. It helps identify relevant mitigation techniques, just like all the other ones. It contributes to risk management, contains some built-in prioritization of threat mitigation. It also encourages collaboration, has some automated components, and it has some vague insufficient documentation. So those are some I've played with, and I've always come back to the stride methodology because I really like its application-centric approach. You can get very, very granular when you're looking at an application or a piece of firmware that you're threat modeling, and as well as with the cloud. So that's the techniques, that's the tool that I use that I really like. All right, so what does STRIDE stand for? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Microsoft and the SDL, they pretty much developed the security development lifecycle, and they came up with this methodology of STRIDE. So let's look at what STRIDE is, right? So it's an acronym, as I said earlier, and it's an acronym for things that can go wrong in security of a product or a system. So spoofing, right? Spoofing is pretending to be something or someone you're not. Tampering, modifying something you're not supposed to modify, right? Man-in-the-middle attack would be an example of that. Repudiation, claiming you didn't do something when you actually did, or claiming you did do something when you actually didn't. So repudiation is pretty much logging, and I'll get into some examples after this. Information disclosure, right? Exposing information to others who are not authorized to see it. Denial of service, attacks designed to prevent a system or device from providing service. And elevation of privilege, when a program, user, or service is able to do things they are not supposed to be able to do. So this is the stride. And the Microsoft tool, which I mentioned earlier, when you do your drawing, you go into analysis, it automatically calculates the stride, which is, I think, a real nice feature of the tool, and the tool is free. So let's look at some examples of what is spoofing, right? So spoofing is a process on the same machine, right? That's an example. An attacker creates a file before a real process, renaming, linking new processes. Spoofing a file, right? You create a file, the local directory, you rename existing files. And then spoofing a machine. Well, the examples are, ARP, IP snooping, DNS spoofing. And then spoofing a person, sets an email display name, takes over a real account, or spoofing a role, declaring themselves to be that role. So those are some examples of spoofing. Tampering, right? So tampering with a file. Well, an attacker typically would try to modify data of a file, even modify properties of a file, right? Ransomware is an example of modifying a file where you can't get back into it. Tampering with memory. You modify your code, you modify process data, modify data they supply to your API. So when you threat model, I really try to look at an API as closely as I can, because those are, especially when you're going to the cloud, that's pretty critical. Or if you're tampering with a network, right? Redirect data flows to their machine, right? Modify data flowing over a network. Repudiation, I mentioned earlier, gets into logging, but we can look a little bit more as like claims not having logged on. So what do hackers love to do? They like to go in, they're going to go in, try to get into your logs and erase everything. That way they cover their tracks. So when you threat model, you want to say, how is the project protecting that log? That's very critical, because I lived and died by logs in my past, and for forensics, they're key, in my opinion. Of course, mentioning attacking the logs, right? Gaps in what's being logged, modification of logs. These are the things that you want to make sure you protect when it comes to the repudiation. So now we're going to look at some examples of information disclosure, right? So a threat example is information disclosure against a process. Well, what does the attacker do? Well, he's able to extract secrets from error messages, right? Username and passwords. Information disclosure against data stores. Well, this is where the attacker can take advantage of the ACL, access control lists, bad permissions. Cryptographic keys on disks or memory, right? We never want to store a private key on an embedded device or in software, right? The private key should be always on a TPM, right? If it has to be on the device, like an embedded device, a trusted platform module, right? For secure boot and other functions that you can use a TPM for. Information found in files and directory names, as well as temp files, and then finding PII from the logs, right? Personal identifiable information, right? So on the denial of service, right? So on the denial of service against a process, right? Can an attacker launch an attack against a device where the RAM just gets so overflows or disk space, and you absorb the CPU bandwidth? Denial of service against a data store, right? So writing consumes data stores, creates an enormous amount of requests, slows down the system or device. Now we've got an availability issue, right, with a DOS. That's very critical not to occur on an ICS system. And then denial of service against the data flows, which consumes network resources, flooding the network with packets, sending invalid packets to flood a system. So those are examples of a denial of service. Elevation of privilege. So an example is elevation of privilege against a process. Right? The attacker is going to send inputs to code that can't handle properly, gain access to read or write memory, right? So this is where the team hopefully sanitizes inputs and outputs in their code, right? Elevation through misuse authorization checks. The authorization checks are not performed, gaps in authorization checks. Elevation through bugs, right? So this is where static code analysis is very important. You should be doing static code analysis through your entire build process. That way you catch some of these mistakes or potential issues. Nothing's 100%, but we do the best we can. Data tampering, they can elevate their privileges that way, which is the modification of data that controls permissions. So that's kind of the example of stride. And so let's look at some mitigations that we can do. So the types of threats. So spoofing, the property is usually authentication. Some mitigation techniques can be basic authentication. Better still would be two-factor authentication, or MFA. You have a PKI, SSL, TLS, digital signatures, and hashing. Tampering, we're looking at the integrity, right? And integrity can be protected or mitigated with access control lists, permissions, digital signatures, as well as SSL and SSH. Repudiation, or the property of non-repudiation, or also known as logging, right, is you mitigate with strong authentication, security logging, and auditing, digital signatures, and secure timestamps. Right. Another way too is if you have a syslog, you send all your logs out to an external device like a syslog or a SIM, right? So at least you have an ongoing stream of that logging for forensics and for correlating attacks if they were to occur. Information disclosure. Now we're dealing with confidentiality. So here we deal with mitigating with ICLs, access control lists, encryption, appropriate key, and secret management. Denial of service. Now we're looking at availability, right? And that we mitigate with, again, access control lists, filters, rate limiting and throttling, authorization, high availability design, and task priorities. And elevation of privilege, we're looking at authorization, access control lists, group or role membership, role-based access control, and input validation. So these are some examples of the threats identified by the STRIDE methodology, the properties, and these are some examples of mitigation technologies that we can do, right? You never want to come up with custom and cryptography. You always want to use off-the-shelf accepted cryptography, for example. So always try to stay with what's conventional, because when you get into customization to mitigate issues, you can potentially have problems, right? So I've been asked by others about the cyber kill chain and threat modeling. I don't use it, but I want to talk about a little bit just to present it. And basically, the kill chain is used to describe various stages of a cyber attack as it pertains to network security, right? The model was developed by Lockheed Martin, an American company, and is used for identification and prevention of cyber intrusions. So to me, the cyber kill chain is far more useful as a roundtable discussion with all parties in discussing how to secure the network. In threat modeling at the application or system level, I tried. I don't use this, but I want to talk about it. So what's inside the cyber kill chain? Well, you have your reconnaissance. An example of that is harvesting mail accounts. Weaponization is to combine an exploit with a backdoor, right? Those are always nightmares. The delivery, deliver a payload via email or web. So in the case of firmware or software, it's very critical to sign the firmware. That way, if someone tries to inject bad firmware, if it's not signed, it doesn't recognize the signature, and with the public key that's embedded inside the embedded device, it's going to reject that bad firmware, just as an example, right? Exploitation is to find vulnerability to execute code. Install malware on a target. Again, signed firmware would mitigate that on an embedded device. Command and control, acquire a channel for remote control and manipulation, and actions on objectives, and the intruder gets inside, which we don't want that, especially on a circuit breaker or a PLC. We don't want anything getting inside a system, right? So let's talk about how to perform a threat model. All right. So in the ICS world, and I'll give you some more examples of some ICS standards that we use. This was an interesting article I found, and it gave this drawing, kind of giving examples of when to do a threat model. All right. So here we have these different sections, and you'll notice here threat analysis, practice 2, scope of paper. So the question is, do you do a threat model before the design or after the design or during the design? I think you should do a threat model before you lay down your design. That's my opinion. All right. Some other practices, we look at code analysis, which you should be doing as during every build process. Every build, if you're doing a nightly build, you should do a static code analysis, right? Your penetration testing, probably should do some testing, when you have enough code that's advanced to maybe do some of that. How do you harden a device? Documentation is important, which I discuss in a threat model, right? Is there documentation? Because documentation can also be a mitigation, right? That's users' guides and best practices. Your update management and some other things. So I thought this was kind of an interesting diagram written by these people down here, and I made the citation, so if you want to go back, you can read the paper yourselves. So I mentioned we have a standard. The IEC 62443 is a standard that in the ICS world that a lot of the vendors are going with. I work for a manufacturer, Schneider Electric, and you'll see I put a red arrow under component. And what that is 62443-4-1 is a standard. It's got 8 practices, which threat modeling is part of. And so we threat model what's called for the product development requirement, right? Because the threat model is very important, and it's the life cycle of a product. The threat model is, as I mentioned earlier, is to avoid any issues that could occur and to find mitigations, right? It's a living document. So some other things I'll break down, it would be like 4-2 gets into the security requirements, right? So you should have an idea of security requirement. What is it that you want to secure? How much security you want, where it's, the balance between business, marketing requirements, and all these other complicated things. Some other things in the standard, next level would be the system. All right, so like 3-3 would be a security system. So if you're threat modeling a system, right? That's where the 3-3 comes into play. Your policies and procedures are the 2 series, and then your generals are 1 series. So this is a standard that's been evolved by ISA, IEC, and it's something that is for the embedded world as well as software SCADA. We're looking at now, I'm in a working group for the IoT, so now we're trying to take this standard and evolve it to encompass the industrial Internet of Things, and of course, integrating with the cloud, which is a pretty big thing. So those are some of the things that the community is working on worldwide, right? So I always get asked, who must attend a threat model, right? So you should have your project manager there, the key members of your software development team, right? Your architect, software, cloud, embedded. QA should be there, right? Your quality assurance, or also PQL. Your security architect, typically, or it can be the advisor as well, but it should be an impartial leader of the threat modeling session, right? Because whoever's running a threat model should really have no vested interest in this, right? Because we can get myopic in our own work. So those are some people who should be attending a threat model. Be prepared if it's a large project, like I said, I've done threat models that are 8 hours, 5 days. Some of the things that happens is people would tell me, well, this guy's really busy. He'll come in and go out and all this, and people don't fully attend the whole session. I would discourage that practice. Get everybody in there that's a stakeholder in the project, and make them stay for the entire session. You will get done. You will save time, and you will get a more accurate product at the end of your threat model, right? So a threat model, also, keep this in mind, is a living document that follows the entire life cycle of a project, including its evolution, right? Don't do a threat model and say, oh, that's nice, and put it on the shelf. I've actually had this happen, and several years later, it's like, oh, we have a problem, right? That must follow the entire life cycle of the product, right? It's a living document. You need to make updates when you make changes that affect the drawing, right? Don't do a drawing just because you did something. Make sure that you update the drawing if you're making an evolution, or you're adding a protocol, or you're adding a new service, for example, right? As I mentioned earlier, depending on the complexity and depth, threat models can take a few hours to multiple days. So be prepared, right? The shortest threat model I did was 4 hours. The longest one I did was 5 days, 8 hours a day. So it can take a lot of time. All right. So to draw a threat model, right? Well, there's a lot of commercial and free open source tools you can use to perform a threat model. As I mentioned earlier, I use the Microsoft tool. It's free. It automatically calculates the stride for you. You can do some customization. You do a search for Microsoft Threat Model, find the most recent revision. I think it's a great tool. It has its problems. It's got its limitations. But if you're just starting out on Threat Model, I really recommend the tool, right? When you threat model, keep in mind your use case. What standards, right? What are the standards that you're going to be using that could be affected, right? ISO 27001, the GDPR when it comes to privacy. Those are the things you have to keep in mind when you're threat modeling, right? Because they can affect, the things can, how you protect the database, for example, especially with PII, private identifiable information, right? You pseudo-anonymized, you encrypt the database, things like that. And then time management is very, very critical. Right? As I said earlier, all the participants, stakeholders must be present through the entire exercise. It will, trust me, because if people leave and come back and you're done with the threat model and you miss something, get everybody in there. That way there's some synergy and they bounce off of each other, and it just makes things much, much better when you do a threat model, right? So after you draw a threat model, you have to assess the risks, right? You have to score everything, right? The findings is where the team needs to investigate an item identified during the threat model. If there is no known item for mitigation at the time, well, then it needs to be investigated, right? Even an item that's deemed mitigated still has a risk, right? Mitigation doesn't mean it's fixed. It means the risk's been minimized, right? There are several methods for rating the severity of these threats. One method is the CVSS, scoring methodology, and I'll give an example of that later. Also, all your findings, right? Anything that needs investigation that hasn't been resolved, that needs to feed back into the project's requirements, right? So it's not like, oh, that's nice and move on. These things have to be resolved, right? So here's an example of the CVSS calculator. It's open source, it's freely online. Here's an example of what it looks like. The base score discusses like the attack vector, the attack complexity, privileges required, user interaction, and the scope. And then you have your triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So this is one way where every time when you do a threat model, you have an item that needs investigation is mitigated, you want to score it accordingly, right? Here's an example that's critical. So in this case, the attack vector was done across a network. It's a high complexity, no privileges, no user interaction. The scope means, well, can you change some things? Yeah, I can. And there's an explanation on this. Highly recommend you read the documentation. It explains it very clearly. And then your problem, is there a problem with confidentiality, integrity, you mark them all high. So now you have a critical issue, which means this needs to be resolved. It needs to be fixed. So that's just an example of what I use for calculating threats. CVSS is internationally recognized. Pen testers use this scoring when they're done to score their findings in a pen test. So I want to do an example of a threat model. So this is a fictional device. And here we have the Truss Boundary. You have a square in the middle here. You have this square, right? You have these different processes, right? You have a data store. You have a web server. And I also mentioned a USB device. I tend to draw USB devices because they're kind of an interesting thing. Bad things can happen. I don't draw Ethernet ports, but this is an example of where you have an external entity going to a SCADA server, you have a browser, you have a syslog server. So here is an example where you have machine Truss Boundary showing there's a separation of an HMI as well as an email server and so forth. So this is an embedded device. You'll note too that I like to do bidirectional traffic. If it's a read and a write, I put two-way traffic, because many times I'll see threat models with one-way traffic, and to me that's not correct, unless it really is one-way. Like in the case between the log data store to the syslog server, that is a one-way push. But if it's going to read-write to a database or to a process, then I put bidirectional. People say, well, it gets too complicated, but also keep in mind, when you do a threat model, whoever comes up behind you who's unfamiliar with it should see the detail of what's a read and a write. So to me, the detail is important. Also, name your data flows accordingly. Name them where they make sense. If you have 100 data flows that all say HTTPS or HTTP, that can be a little tricky when you go through the analysis view. So be very sure to write the details of the data flow and name them accordingly, all right? So I'm going to do an example of an IoT threat model. So you'll notice on the left, I have an IoT device. It's in its own local zone. I put a truss boundary. There's a traffic that's going to a response and then back from a Zigbee. I'm sorry, there's a communication going to a field gateway via Zigbee and then a response via Zigbee. Another truss boundary going up to the cloud on Azure. So now I have an IoT gateway, right? So that's a process turning. I have a truss boundary because then it goes to the front end. There's a communication to the identity management where you go FE to IM to FE. And you'll notice even though it's on the cloud, I put a truss boundary to a database. The reason for that is I always do that because a database, there has to be some form of authentication or a token, right? Obviously, there are other things like you have front-end process to identity management. There's no trust boundary there because there's no real token there. Whereas a database, to me, I always put a trust boundary because there is authentication, and we want to clearly show these things in our drawings to that way to clearly define for whoever comes up behind you can understand this very quickly and get up to speed. Right? Well, that's all I have. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time, and I want to thank EC Council very much for allowing me to do this presentation on threat modeling, and I hope it's helpful.